3. The Desire Named Marx. Libidinal Marx. We must come to take Marx as if he were a writer, an author full of affects. Take his text as a madness and not as a theory. We must succeed in pushing aside his theoretical barrier and stroking his beard without contempt and without devotion. No longer the false neutrality which Marleau-Ponty advised in the past for someone who, he said, has now become a classic and must be treated no differently than Hegel or Aristotle. No, stroke his beard as a complex libidinal volume, reawakening his hidden desire, and ours along with it. There is no need to criticize Marx, and even if we do criticize him, it must be understood that it is in no way a critique. We have already said and repeated that we laugh at critique, since it is to maintain oneself in the field of the criticized thing, and in the dogmatic, indeed paranoiac, relation of knowledge. Marx's desire interests us not for itself, but inasmuch as it informs the themes of writings which metamorphose into themes of social and political practices. Marx must be introduced, the big fat Marx, and also the little Marx of the Epicurean and Lutheran studies, this entire continent, into the atlas of libidinal cartography, or rather the reverse, to start crossing this strange country with our affections and disaffections, letting our attachments and our deceptions circulate, refining our analysis here, neglecting it there, because we have neither the hope nor the intention of setting up a portrait of the work, of giving an interpretation of it. We do not interpret, we read, and we affect by writings. We have for a long time, having read Marx, operated by means of practices, since this is the word left us by the Greeks as a disastrous heritage. We say this not to render the libidinal use we make of the old man more justifiable or less shameful, rather to situate these practices in the sphere of what rightly belongs to interpretation. A Marxist political practice is an interpretation of a text, just as a social or Christian spiritual practice is the interpretation of a text. So much so that practices are themselves texts, insofar as they are interpretations. And this is precisely what we desire not to do here. We no longer want to correct Marx, to reread him, or to read him in the sense that the little Althusserians would like to read capital, to interpret it according to its truth. We have no plan to be true, to give the truth of Marx. We wonder what there is of the libido in Marx, and in Marx means in his text or in his interpretations, mainly in practices. We will rather treat him as a work of art. We will take some incontestable detail, considered minor, and which in fact it is in regard to the manifest themes of the work. Quite certain, however, that it is not so for the libidinal geography of the continent. We note even this, libidinal economist friends. We feel almost obliged, as you've just heard, to make some sort of a declaration of intentions, a little solemn, vaguely epistemological, as little as possible, nevertheless, take note, at the shores of this continent. No other continent would extract such declarations from us, although they remain somewhat stupid and certainly useless. We could say that it is through suspicion and intimidation, warned as we are by a militant past of, when laying a hand on Marx, even, and indeed especially if it were to screw with him, we are closely watched by the paranoiacs calling themselves Marxist politicians, and in general all the whites of the left. We would therefore prudently warn, it is in this state of mind, this state of heart, this state of body, that we approach the old man. But the libidinal truth of our preamble lies elsewhere. It already states the essential, which is this. The old man is also a young woman to us, a strange bisexual assemblage. The dispositifs which channel their impulsions into theoretical discourses and will give rise to organisms of power, the very ones which will harden into the German party, the Bolshevik party. These dispositifs are, of course, compromise formations. They are so many attempts to stabilize the force on the libidinal front. Mediations, oh, how alienated, as he loved to say, interposed between the fluxes of desire and the regions into which they travel. This happens not only in certain themes, or at least in certain minor motifs, some of which we will pick out. Its position is established first of all in something quite astonishing, the perpetual postponement of finishing work on capital, a chapter becoming a book, a section a chapter, a paragraph a section, by a process of cancerization of theoretical discourse, by a totally pulsional proliferation of a network of concepts hitherto destined, on the contrary, to finalize, to define, and to justify a proletarian politics. Hence, by the racing of a discursive machinery explicitly, however, laying claim to rationality, theoretical practical. Is the non finito a characteristic of rational theory? We are able to support this in these post-relative days, but for Marx, and therefore for Engels the impatient, it must rather have been a bizarre, worrying fact. We say that this postponement, which results in the economy never being completed, and in the calculations of capital, Book 3, being false, already demonstrates a whole dispositif, a libidinal monster with the huge fat head of a man full of warrior's thoughts and petty quarrels, and with the soft body of young amorous Renan, a monster which never achieves the realization of its unity because of this very incapacity, and it is this failure which is marked by the interminable theoretical suspense. What we have here is not exactly the centaur, the master of politicians, as Chiron was the master of Achilles. Rather, it would be the hermaphrodite, another monster in which femininity and masculinity are indiscernibly exchanged, thereby thwarting the reassurance of sexual difference. But it is exactly this which is in question in the economy, and we maintain, dear comrades, the following thesis. The little girl Marx, offended by the perversity of the polymorphous body of capital, requires a great love. The great prosecutor Karl Marx, assigned the task of the prosecution of the perverts and the invention of a suitable lover, the proletariat, sets himself to study the file of the accused capitalist. What happens when the person assigned to the prosecution is as fascinated by the accused as he is scandalized by him? It comes about that the prosecutor sets himself to finding 100,000 good reasons to prolong the study of the file, that the inquiry becomes meticulous, always more meticulous, that the lawyer submerged in the British Museum in the microscopic analysis of the aberrations of capital is no longer able to detach himself from it, that the organic unity, that this swarming of perverse fluxes that is supposed to have to produce, dialectically, never stops moving away, escaping him, being put off, and that the submission of petitions is kept waiting interminably. What was happening then throughout the thousands of manuscript pages? The unification of Marx's body, which requires that the polymorphous perversity of capital be put to death for the benefit of the fulfillment of the desire for genital love, is not possible. The prosecutor is unable to deduce the birth of a new and beautiful inorganic body, similar to that of pre-capitalist forms, which would be child socialism, from the pornography of capitalism. If there is a body of capital, this body is sterile. It engenders nothing. It exceeds the capacity of theoretical discourse as unification. I do not want to be resigned to sending just anything, Marx wrote to Engels, who presses him, 31st of July, 1865, prior to having the whole work in his sight. Whatever defect they may have, it is to the advantage of my writings that they constitute an artistic whole, and I can only achieve this result in my own way and by never having them printed until I have them before me in their entirety. These writings on their own, however, never constitute this visible artistic whole, whose model is an inorganic body, organic insofar as it is a complete and fecund totality, inorganic insofar as it is not biological, but theoretical here, the same unitary model which will be desired and recognized in pre-capitalist forms or in socialism, this time on the socio-economic plane. The young, innocent little girl Marx says, "You see, I am in love with love. This must stop. This industrial and industrious crap. This is what makes me anxious. I want to return to the inorganic body, and it has been taken over by the great bearded scholar so that he may establish the thesis that it cannot stop, and so that he may testify, as the counsel to the poor, amongst which is the little girl Marx, to his revolutionary conclusions. So that he may perform the obstetrics of capital, so that he may give to her this total body he requires, this child, at least, this child of words, which would be the anticipated double, the younger child born first, of the child of flesh, of the proletariat, of socialism. But alas, he does not give her this child. She will never have this artistic whole before her, these writings in their entirety. She will have suffering growing before her and in her, because the prosecutor will discover in the course of his research, insofar as it is endless, a strange jouissance. The same jouissance that results from the instantiation of the pulsions and their discharge in postponement, the jouissance of infinity. This perversity of knowledge is rightly called scientific research, and intensity there is not, as it is in orgasm. Normal, the intensity of discharge instantiated in a genital couple, but is the intensity of an inhibition, of a putting into reserve, of a postponement of an investment in means. So much so that the prosecutor charged with obtaining proof of the pornographic ignominy of capital repeats, in his inquiry and even in his preparation and pleading, this same "don't come yet," so to speak, which is simply another modality of jouissance, which is found in the libidinal dispositif of capital. While as concerns the content, it is always in search of the lovable body which she desires, the form of this research already contains its denial and its impossibility. This is why the attention which this body is able to command, and to which it must have the right, provokes the bad temper of the paradoxical defender of the poor. When the refugees from the Commune fled to London, and the International was fully preoccupied with them, while in short something like the subversive reality of this proletarian socialist body, supposedly much sought after, comes to explode in the eyes of the world, and, it seems, in the eyes of the author of the address to the Committee of the International, dated 30th of May 1871, what does Marx find to write, on 9th November of that same year, to Danielson, his Russian translator, who is awaiting the corrections to the text of the first chapter? It is, without any doubt, quite useless to await a revision of the first chapter, for my time has, for some months, been so taken up, and on this point there is little hope of improvement in the near future, that I am unable to pursue my theoretical labours any more. It is certain that one fine morning I will put an end to all this, but there are circumstances where one is morally bound to busy oneself with things much less attractive than study and theoretical research. Not very attractive, says the equivocal prosecutor, your fine proletarian body. Again we catch a glimpse of the infamous prostitution of capital. But, you say, this suspension of theoretical labour on capital, this is not for 1 second a pleasure in the sense of a security, an irresponsibility. It is, on the contrary, the result of a libidinal transaction. It is the price that the young amorous girl Marx's desire for the reconciled body is made to pay by the fat-headed accuser Marx with the shattered social body. Ah, you dream of the relation of non-domination between men and things, and between men themselves, and between men and women. All right then, show the consistency of the dream. Demonstrate that reality too dreams this dream. That is to say, you also pay in word products, in articulations, in structured arguments, endlessly. Wasn't this said, in substance, in the peripheries of the work, in 1844? The proletariat is Christ, and his real suffering is the price of his redemption, and this is why it is not enough that a particular wrong is done him, a shopkeeper's wrong, a pathetic limitation of his profit margin, for example. No, his redemption requires a total suffering, therefore a total wrong, as the proletariat will be for Marx, once and for all, and as Marx will be once and for all for the proletariat required by the desire named Marx. Christ the proletariat, Marx his witness martyr, theoretical discourse being his cross, his torture. Certainly, we may put it this way, in terms of a religious metaphor, but it misses the essential because it presupposes exactly what turns out to be in question in Marx's desire. It presupposes this body of reference as a sacrifice, body of capital for the martyr of the proletariat, body of the proletariat for Marx's martyr, without which sacrifice and martyr go up in smoke, and are no more than phantasms of guilt. In other words, the sacrificial metaphor is not libidinally neutral, it is not economically correct. It is topically correct. It requires a principle, be it imaginary, which nonetheless requires a symbolic medium, of unification and inscription, in comparison to which pain and pleasure, here those of Marx's research, may be counted, registered. And what if it was precisely this referential instance which Marx's inspection turned out to lack, this body of ratio of the account? What if what would prolong the research interminably were not, as psychoanalytic or Nietzschean crassness wouldn't fail to say, Karl Marx's masochist desire or bad conscience, but the vertigo of a terrible discovery, always hidden, that there is no one to keep the accounts of suffering and jouissance, and that this too is the domination of money capital? If we restrict ourselves to a critique, which means, of course, non-critique, of whatever guilt or ressentiment there is in the assemblage of the Desire Named Marx, and generally named militant, we will de facto remain in the religious metaphor. We will replace the religious metaphor with an irreligious metaphor, still religious then, in which judgments will be discovered at work according to good and evil in reference to a new God, which will be desire. Movement will be good, investment evil. Action as innovation and the force of the event will be good, reaction reiterating identity, evil. And how will we then describe the Marx or militant libidinal dispositif? We turn to the passion for expiation and ressentiment. Every reversal of the first into the last, but just as much of the dominant into the equal, which forms the figure of the revolution, implies, we say, the intention of a price to be charged. If Marx authorized himself to set himself up as the proletarians' advocate and petition against their exploiters, if he can declare to them, this is why it is you who will pay the price, it is, we say again, on condition that he had marked down the suffering, the expiation and the ressentiment on his own body, and that he himself suffers and pays. Is this not the law which gives the right to the desire for revolution in the sphere of ressentiment? That the militant had formed his own body into a monstrous composition, so that the woman proletariat would obtain the most durable man prosecutor and the greatest total pain. That all revolutionary ressentiment will be played out between little girl Marx and old man Marx on its body. Far from emancipating ourselves through such a critique of what we detest, religion, ressentiment, guilt, morality, we will only invert its signs. Marx wants an inorganic body. Does his desire enslave it to a genital model? We want a schizophrenic model and an unstable body. Marx wants to charge. We want generalized gratuity. Marx accuses. We exonerate. Marx the proletariat suffers and redeems. We joyfully love all that appears, etc. A new morality, a new religion, is in fact merely a very ancient ethics, itself strongly reactive, since the party of movement and existence has always existed at the core of religions, at least of those taking authority from a revelation, to act as a counterpoison in belief and in the systems of belief, every time that its adversary, the party of order and structure, has ended up wearying the faithful and even the priests. Do we want to be merely the saviors of a fallen world, then? The hearts of a heartless world, prophets, cruel, very cruel as the program goes, for a humanity without words? Do we bring new values, then? In denouncing militant ressentiment, we are doing nothing other than valorizing a certain sort of libidinal dispositif. In fact, the admirable viscosity of the fluxes ceaselessly setting up and wiping out on the great libidinal film. We affirm its exclusive value, but the exclusive value is called truth. Therefore, we affirm schizo-desire, there's truth. How then does the dispositif of our affirmation differ from that by which the ancient statements, love is the truth, renunciation is the truth, knowledge is the truth, socialism is the truth, were affirmed? Doesn't their reactive element lie in their power of exclusion? Are we too not going to exclude? How pitiful. This, then, is not how the libidinal dispositif named Marx should be described, merely described, not as the effect of ressentiment. Our rule should be never to describe anything as effect. We should describe everything as capable of effects. Now there is, in the interminable postponement of the prosecution's revolutionary summation in Marx, a certain effective force. Theoretical discourse ceases to be presented according to its closure, even though this is what it seeks. What Marx perceives as failure, suffering, and maybe even lives through as ressentiment, is the mark on his work of a situation which is precisely the same as that of capital, and which gives rise to a strange success as much as to an awful misery. The work cannot form a body, just as capital cannot form a body. And this absence of organic, artistic unity gives rise to two divergent movements, always associated in a single vertigo, a movement of flight, of plunging into the bodiless, and thus of continual invention, of expansive additions or affirmations of new pieces, statements, but elsewhere musics, techniques, ethics, to the insane patchwork, a movement of tension, and a movement of institution of an organism, of an organization, and of organs of totalization and unification, a movement of reason. Both kinds of movement are there, effects as force in the non-finito of the work, just as in that of capitalism. Marx's inability to catch up with his book, a delay which is equally an advance upon it, a form of temporal dislocation in any case, rather than being considered as an effect of masochism or guilt, should be compared with the way in which Sterne makes a theme of this delay in Tristram Shandy. In each case, the following configuration is involved: to fabricate a discourse, whether narrative or theoretical, implying a new, unprecedented organization of space and time, the writer, narrator, theoretician, uses space and time. With Sterne, this use, or this usury, is inscribed in the narrative itself, and devours it. The place and the duration occupied by the narrative act little by little invade those which should be given over to the narration of the story, and render this latter impossible, or at least transform it into the narrative of this invasion and this impossibility. With Marx, the effect that the active elaboration has on the space-time of theoretical discourse is not explicitly marked in this latter, and the final impossibility of the domination of the duration and location in a discourse, which is here theoretical and no longer narrative, but which nevertheless refers to a supposed story taken as a reference, does not give rise to Sterne's desperate humor, to a style. With Marx, the expression of this despair remains repressed, caught, and hidden between his activity of fabricating apodictic final statements, and the statements, not even assertive, which he publishes in another text, those of confessions, letters, abandoned or withdrawn manuscripts, lecture notes, plans. But this despair gives rise, in whatever way, to theoretical suspense. It opens the void of, wait until I have finished. This void is that of the mediator alienating the subject, Marx, Sterne, and the object, the book, to speak in Marx's language. It is that of inhibition, which leads desire from its primary object towards the means of its realization. It is that of capital, which loves production rather than the product, and for which the product is only the means of producing. It is that of the Communist Party, which loves not the revolution, but the means by which they are able to make it happen, which in their hands is only a pretext to the machinery for capitalizing the desire for revolution. Therefore, this void is that in which the mechanisms of power are constructed, but it is also the supple viscosity of capitalism as fragments of the body, as connected, disconnected singularities, as amnesia, decentered and anarchic, as harlequinade, as metamorphoses without inscription, as the undoing of totalities and totalizations, as ephemeral groupings of unforeseen affirmations.